Well, good afternoon and welcome to our January Ranching 101 webinar. As we begin the new year, it's essential to be proactive in herd health strategies to guarantee the well-being and productivity of cattle. Joining us today is Dr. Jacob Warner. But before I start, I'd like to thank our friends at Lone Star Ag Credit, who have rebranded and are now named Ag Trust, for sponsoring this month's webinar. So if you would please join me in watching this short video for some brief remarks.
I came down here about 12 years ago to work with my artwork and fell in love with the country and feel very fortunate to be out here. It means a lot to be able to pass this piece of property on to our kids. It's a blessing to be able to have somebody like Lone Star Ag to be able to help you be able to do something like that for generations down the road to have. Uh,
Thank you to Ag Trust for their continued support. At this time, I want to remind everyone to join us on February 20th for our next Ranching 101, where we will discuss top tricks for negotiating alternative energy contracts. Today, we are excited to hear from Dr. Jacob Warner, who developed a passion for the well-being of livestock at a young age. His roots run deep in the cattle industry, and after graduating from Texas A&M Vet School, he returned to his hometown to commence his career at Elgin Veterinary Hospital, collaborating with his father, a seasoned practitioner with 45 years of experience in large animal medicine. Jacob finds fulfillment in playing an active role, aiding producers in boosting their herd's efficiency, productivity, and overall health. These measures, which emphasize vaccinations, regular checkups, and improved nutrition, aim to empower raisers to foster a healthy and thriving herd throughout the year. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the chat box. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Warner.
All right. Well, thank you, Bryn, for that. Let me let's start a screen share. Can everyone see that all right?
Yes,
All
you're
right.
good.
Let me move this over so I can kind of see everything. All right. So as Bryn introduced myself, I'm Dr. Jacob Warner. I am a relatively new graduate, but I grew up in the cattle industry, and I don't know who recommended me to sit here and give a presentation to y'all, but I'm deeply honored and I'm excited for the opportunity. I look forward to sharing some of my knowledge, and especially for those kind of starting out in the cattle industry. And if you have any questions, if we have a little bit of time afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. And if we run out of time, of course, I'll have my contact information here at the end of the slideshow. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I wrote down my personal email, and I'll be happy to get with you. So today we're going to have an overview of herd health. I know online it was kind of titled the schedules for herd health, and I will address schedules a little bit. But sometimes that's hard for A, veterinarians, and B, producers, because there's no correct one protocol that fits everyone. Every production system's a little different, every producer's goals and their labor and everything they can put in is a little bit different. So I encourage you as we go along, and I'll talk about that as building a relationship with a veterinarian that can kind of help you and better understand your production system and how your operation works, and tailor a protocol and towards your specific production. All right, so let's see. Why are we not? All right, so a little bit about myself. I work here at Elgin Veterinary Hospital. You can kind of see that in the middle image. There's two guys there. The other little older gentleman is my father, Dr. Gary Warner. I'm extremely blessed to have the opportunity to step into the practice that I grew up in and work alongside my father, but also take advantage of his mentorship and his 40 plus years of experience. Um, growing up, I grew up here in Elgin, Texas. Grew up on a cattle operation where we ran about 350 to 400 head of cattle at one time. That's where I kind of cut my teeth in learning about herd health and learning about cows and their nature and how to take care of them. After graduation, I went on and played junior college football for a couple of years before transferring to Texas A&M, where I got a degree and bachelor's in animal science. Then started my master's in animal science under Dr. Skaggs before being accepted into vet school, where I graduated here in May, and then I finished my master's here in August. Up there in the top left, you can see a little redheaded dog. His name's Rip. If you ever come visit me here at the clinic, you may bump into him, say hi. He's quite a joy to be around. So I want to start this off with kind of expressing that you should probably build a relationship with a veterinarian. That way you have a veterinary client relationship. That helps you build one with a veterinarian that kind of helps them understand how your production is, what your goals are. That way we can help you meet those goals. And then also with that, discussing herd health protocols, what we can do if we have a disease outbreak, or why we may be seeing gaps in nutrition or fertility, and kind of help solve those issues. With that being said, probably take some considerations into account. It seems like these days there are fewer and fewer veterinarians that are willing to do large animal work. So finding one that does a large amount of large animal or cattle work may be hard to find. Of course, there's practices like mine that we focus solely on cattle, and we do see some sheep and goats and some show pigs here and there, but we're deeply embedded in it. With that, also that knowing that there's fewer large animal veterinarians, there's decreasing or an increasing amount of veterinarians that aren't willing to take after hour calls or emergencies. So I encourage you. I know that there's a lot of producers out there that this is part-time for them, or maybe their hobby. And so whenever you get off work or when you have a chance, check those cattle earlier in the afternoon or evening. That way, if you have an issue, you can get a hold of a veterinarian at a reasonable time. That way we can offer guidance in what we need to do, or if we need to make a ranch call or bring that animal in. And it's also, with that being said, it's difficult for veterinarians sometimes to get away from the clinic. I don't know about I can't speak for all veterinarians, but here I have currently, I think, around 30 head in the hospital. And then on top of appointments, it's difficult for me to go out, and Texas is a large area, and I can get a call from someone that's only 30 miles away, upwards an hour and a half drive there, not including seeing the patient and then having to get back here to the hospital. So those are some things just to take into consideration whenever we're talking about making a connection with a veterinarian. Kind of as a basis, especially for producers that are starting out, I encourage kind of investing a little bit of money in working pens that are safe, for yourself, as well as safe for the animal. So, and I'm not saying they have to be extremely nice, just something that's that you can kind of handle a few head or whatever number of livestock you may have, kind of maybe a little bit safer than the image you see there in the top left. I also encourage you to maybe invest in a trailer, or have a friend or family member nearby that can help you transport those animals if you need to happen to bring them into the hospital or haul them for market, or you name it, as well as a squeeze chute. There's a wide variety. If you have any questions on maybe which one might be a good starter investment, or price range, or whatever, we can have a conversation about that. I have I've worked with a lot of them. Some I like better than others, but something that we can safely restrain the animal. That way, if we have an issue or we need to examine them, we have a place to safely do so for that, and that's for us again and for the animal. And also, every animal should have an ID. There's a couple ways we can do that, whether it be an ear tag or a brand. We have, of course, the traditional fire brand, a hot brand. I like those because they're permanent and they stay with the animal for life. Freeze brands are a really cool use of permanent ID, but if you have lighter hided cattle, that doesn't always work. They show up great on dark hided or black hided cows, but they aren't suitable for all animals. We can use an ear tattoo, as you see it kind of right there next to the Freeze brand. Those are great, and you may if you have some registered cattle, you may have some with ear tags, but or ear tattoos. But sometimes those can be hard to read, and depending on how they were applied and where they were applied and how long they've been there. Ear tags, all my cattle have ear tags along with Firebrand. That allows us to easily see them, maybe from the front or from a little bit of a distance with some binoculars. But there is some drawbacks to that. They do fall out sometimes or get ripped out if they get snagged in something like a barbed wire fence. For the more progressive farmer or rancher, we see the electronic ear tags becoming more popular. This one down here in the bottom right corner is an example of a brucellosis vaccination tag. This has actually a little RFID chip in the middle of it, and we can use a wand and scan that, and it'll read the number off. And if you're pretty handy with using Excel sheets or another software, that's a good way to keep records. You can keep body condition score, maybe how long bred, how far along she is in pregnancy, and a few other data points. And that allows us to keep record of that. And it's easy because it pulls up every time we scan that deal. I'm not quite that fancy yet, but I do have the wand to read them. And we're working on becoming more proficient in that. As we go along, and as you may recognize, some of your cattle may have a metal tag. We're trying to transition more towards these electronics. We can still get the metal tags, to my knowledge, but I think over time they're trying to transition away from those. So physical exam / monitoring, this is something we can do year round, especially whenever we get those cattle up to either preg check or give them annual boosters. Something kind of we want to watch year round, especially after we wean a calf or we have calves on the ground, is watching the body condition score. We'll talk about that a little bit later here in the presentation. Also temperament. If that cow is consistently putting us up on the fence or trying to hook us, maybe that's not one we need to keep around. Udder shape and size, and then also with that teat conformation. Something we can monitor, especially as those cows get up in age. Sometimes those teats can get rather large, and that's hard for a calf to nurse, especially when they're newborns. And will require some extra work. Maybe we need to strip those teats out to allow the calf to better nurse. And we'll talk about why it's important for those calves nursing soon after they're born here in a couple slides. Also, I want to stress, kind of open up whenever we get those cows in the chute and we have a safe way to restrain them, open up their mouth and look at their teeth. I have some examples here at the bottom, that bottom left over here. That's a full mouth cow. That's an adult cow. She's able to graze and forage and get along all right. But in this cow in the middle here, we call that a broke mouth. She's probably going to be a little bit harder to graze and keep body condition score on her. And over here on the right is an example of a smooth mouth cow. Now, if you have some of those, it's probably towards the end of their production or productive years, and that cow is going to have a little bit harder time keeping weight and maybe even raising the calf, and then ultimately probably breeding back. Those cows with broken mouth and smooth mouth, they I'd probably recommend going ahead and getting those out of your production system and finding some replacements for those. And then one more thing is checking their eyes, especially the cattle with white around their eyes. They can be predisposed to things like cancer. So just check in and make sure we don't have that. This is an example of one that came in the hospital that I think we ultimately ended up doing an enucleation. So as we transition into the herd health aspect, and we'll talk a little bit about immunity. So calves are actually born without any circulating antibodies. The ones that they do end up having come from the dam's serum, or essentially the dam's antibodies. And what I wanted to kind of talk about this a little bit is, especially focusing on this green line, is that this is after birth, and where those antibodies come from is from the colostrum that the cow produces, which is like essentially the first milk. It's has a high concentration of antibodies, and as you can see here, that absorption drops down relatively fast. It's important that if we see a calf born, or we know that it looks relatively fresh, that we're monitoring that calf and ensuring that they get up within about 6 hours of birth to get up and nurse, because every hour that absorption is dropping off. And especially here by hour 12, we're looking at close to 50% absorption. So we're going to transition into talking about vaccines now that we've kind of touched basis on immunity. Vaccines provide us with some immune benefits. It's just like humans getting vaccinated, whether it depends on what disease process we're talking about, but it's overall the same concept. The reason we use vaccines is to mitigate risk. And what those vaccines contain are antigens or agents that cause the disease, whether it be viral or bacterial. We do that, and we give them the vaccine to help the body recognize the pathogen and build some memory to it. That way, if they're exposed to it again in the past, we can the body can recognize it and then hopefully clear that infection before we see clinical signs. One thing to kind of note here is that when we're talking about vaccinating neonates or calves, it doesn't always equal immunization. There's some factors, and we'll talk a little bit about them down the line on this presentation. But factors such as stress, nutrition, and then the immunity they get from colostrum can all kind of affect the efficacy of the vaccines. Whenever you're looking at what vaccines you may want to use or what's one's best for you, you may come across a couple terms, one of them being modified live vaccines. These generally produce a longer immunity. It's because they have a stronger immune response. They don't have an adjuvant in most cases. Now, I believe there's one on the market right now that is marketed as a modified live that does have an adjuvant, and they're relatively poor stability. And when I say stability, I kind of mean, especially with these modified live vaccines, whenever we reconstitute them or we mix them up, and we go ahead and use them, we can't just vaccinate 1 or 2 calves and then throw it in the fridge and then come back even like a day or a week later and use that and expect it to work, opposed to like a killed or otherwise known as an inactivated or attenuated vaccine that has a good stability. We can use that vaccine on maybe a couple of calves or a cow or two, and then store that in a fridge in a cool, dark place, and come back to it, and it usually has the same efficacy. So those killed and attenuated vaccines do provide a little bit shorter immunity, and they have an adjuvant. An adjuvant just being a substance that they put in the vaccine to help increase or bring through a physiological pattern is help the body recognize that there's a pathogen there and help get a better, stronger immune response. So when we're talking about vaccines, one thing to really watch out for, and And I encourage you to read and follow the instructions on the label. The label gives us a few very important information about it. What's in the vaccine, what pathogens, what adjuvant, and then when the booster should be given. Because as you can see here in this bottom right, this little graph, we can see that we give them the initial vaccine and we get an immune response, but then that tapers off relatively quick, and about that 21-day mark. And then at that time, that's when we give a booster vaccine, and then we get a stronger response. And then you can see that it'll taper off as well, but we maintain a little bit of level of those immune cells present. And that's why it's important to, after we vaccinate these calves or cows, that we're going back and boosting those every year. Also, one thing to note is how that vaccine should be administered, whether it be subcutaneously or intramuscularly. You can see that here in that top right image about where we should do that, and I'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit. And then also on those labels, you'll see that if it's labeled safe or not safe for pregnant females. This is very important. Some modified live vaccines are labeled safe for pregnant females, and that's if they were vaccinated with the same vaccine previously, and if you follow the instructions. Even then, for most of my producers, I'm recommending just use a killed vaccine, because not all producers are getting those cows preg checked, and sometimes it's hard to follow that depending on labor. So taking the safer road a little bit using those killed vaccines, and also handling. For the most part, we want to keep those vaccines in a cool place and out of sunlight, especially whenever we're working those animals. So on this slide, it's kind of relating back to the image you saw in the last one. We don't want to inject anything here in the rump or the backside of the cow. Part of that is because sometimes we can get a reaction, or we may get a small abscess or infection at that injection site. And then whenever those cattle or animals eventually go to the market or they go to a slaughterhouse, they may have to cut that out or remove that part, or that part be rendered as a section that can't enter the food chain or be used. So they have to cut that out, and we're losing a little bit of that product there. So according to BQA standards, right here in the neck is the best place to probably inject those. One thing I don't like about this image is that it looks like the subcutaneous site is relatively small. Actually, what it should kind of depict is that subcutaneous spot or area for injection is also encompasses this area of the green triangle, and then the green triangle just being where we can give IM injections. So recommended vaccines, and in this, and what I forgot to preface this and talk about in the beginning of this presentation, if you see a product or a name brand or a company, I'm not affiliated with any of them. I've used many of these products, and they come from different companies. It's just some of these that I've used, and I wanted you to kind of be able to recognize the label or had seen that before. That way, whenever you go to purchase a set of vaccines or talk with your veterinarian, you can have something to kind of reference. But the vaccines I recommend, or the stuff I recommend vaccinating for, would be IBR, BVD, parainfluenza, BRSV, leptospirosis, vibriosis, Clostridial. You can use either a 7-way or an 8-way. Also on this image, I have a Calvary 9, which is a 9-way. I believe that one also contains a tetanus toxoid, as well as the Covaxin 8 there in the bottom right that also contains a tetanus. You can speak, like, I'll be happy to answer questions later, or maybe even after the presentation is done, about the animals we should probably be using tetanus in. And also here at the very bottom, you'll see E. coli, rotavirus, and coronavirus. And I'll talk about those three a little bit later in the presentation, but those are often pathogens that will cause calf scours or calf diarrhea early on in life. And so we'll talk about those coming up towards the end of the presentation. Parasite control. So I get a lot of questions from producers about what should we do for deworming and fly control. And it's sometimes a hard question. You know, it depends on a little bit on your location. If I've heard other veterinarians and producers talk about being east or west of I-35, and talking about how they manage their parasite loads. So kind of just a brief overview. It should be a multimodal approach. So we should be monitoring those animals and knowing that younger animals are more susceptible, using appropriate dosage and intervals for those. And that goes back to kind of following the label and working with a veterinarian. We can take some of those fecal samples and run a fecal egg count. That lets us kind of know what our burden is and maybe even see what we can identify as certain parasites that we need to probably target with a certain class of drugs. And also consideration for liver fluke management, which can cause some diseases. And then one thing to kind of talk about is pasture management. And I think I'll talk about that on the next slide, but one thing we want to be aware of is overgrazing. These parasites pass eggs that are in the feces, and whenever we're overgrazing, where those cattle are grazing closer to those manure piles, and can also pick up a higher burden. So deworming practices. I encourage everyone to develop a program. And then once we have that program in place, to continuously reevaluate. Do we need to make changes, or are we seeing this being effective, or this is no longer effective? With that being said, and it goes back to the fecal egg counts. Maybe occasionally we are watching our body condition, we're watching our cows and our calves, and we notice that they're not doing as well as they used to be. Maybe we work with a veterinarian and do a fecal egg count and see what we need to do, and in terms of changing up our protocol. We want to deworm cattle that are higher risk, and those are going to be those younger cattle, the calves, or the cattle that are younger than 18 months, and especially calves. I bolded and wrote this in red is avoid underdosing. Sometimes that's easier said than done. I know it's hard, and sometimes buying and investing in scales can be expensive, but getting an accurate rate or weight on those animals to be able to get appropriate dosage is going to be key. The reason we do that is because when we're underdosing those animals, we can actually get into a problem with resistance. And that's why we also want to kind of deworm those cattle that need it, i.e. being the younger cattle and calves, because once we have some resistance issues, that causes a little bit of a headache, and we'll end up having to switch medications or deworming protocols to try to combat that. And then we'll, following that up with that, we may run in resistance with those follow-up drugs. And then I talked about this on the last slide, but overgrazing. For overgrazing, one thing we can kind of use to prevent that or work alongside that is using a system of rotational grazing, where we're grazing one pasture down a little bit, and then taking those cattle and moving pastures. That way we can give time for that grass and the previous pasture to grow back up. And then, of course, talking with a veterinarian. One thing that I've heard some veterinarians talk to and taught in school is using a combination of treatments. Usually we can use it like around 2 classes of drugs, and that kind of targets 2 different separate species of parasites, and we can more tailor our parasitic load to treatment. So I've had this question a few times. What is the best product to use? Well, and it sucks because in vet school, I'd always ask a question and get the response of, well, it depends. And now that I'm out in practice and have to talk with clients and producers, I understand why so many professors gave that answer, because it really does. It depends on climate and region, the weather, the animal age, what time parasites are we going after? Are we going after flukes, or are we going after roundworms, tapeworms? And then also something for the producer to consider is injectable versus a pour-on versus an oral. Maybe if we're giving we're going through and vaccinating all those calves and we have to give a couple of injections, maybe we use a pour-on. But of course, I feel like a lot of my producers use ivermectin, and that's we have a couple of solutions for that as well. But just something to consider with, and talking with your local veterinarian or the one you already have a relationship with, and seeing what the best one is for you. Fly control. It's important to control these flies. Over here in the image, I like this one, kind of showing it because it highlights what kind of those numbers look like, whether it's just a few hundred or up to 200. We can have some economic losses, and that's from some of those flies are blood sucking, but also the cows won't be grazing as much because they're more focused on getting rid of those flies off their back. Also, some of them can carry disease like pink eye. So the key is to start prevention or start treating before it's too late, until we get to that 200 horn flies per head example. And also, and I'll talk about this I believe in the next slide, is changing our strategies. So here we have a few options for fly control. One of them being pour-ons. We can use fly tags. We can use cattle rubs or dust bags. And then we also use like a larvicide or a growth regulator in the feed. For example, producers has like a mineral tub that has a growth regulator. But overall, it's going to be important to probably use the same product for a year, maybe 2 years, before switching up methods with a different compound. So we're going to kind of transition into nutrition a little bit, because nutrition is a big role in overall health. So biologically, the animal is going to use nutrients in different ways and kind of partition those for their needs. The first being maintenance. And then after they kind of meet those maintenance goals, they're going to focus on growing, and then transitioning that into lactation, and lastly, reproduction. The animal, if it's if it's not getting the nutrients it needs, it's probably not going to be focused on reproducing more of itself, rather than just maintaining itself and getting to a point where the body's comfortable with reproducing. Unfortunately, most producers see that completely backwards. We as producers want those cattle to reproduce, because that we get that calf on the ground, and we can use it as a replacement or sell it to market. And then with that, we're worried about how our cows are milking, and we're less focused on growth and maintenance. And I failed to add this part in a slide later, but it's something to kind of consider with, especially those younger females. People worry about our heifers getting bred or breeding back, but it's what I've kind of already been exposed to in practice and notice is that sometimes those 3 and 4 year olds are the ones that are having a hard time breeding back. And it's because you have to consider that those cattle are still growing and maturing. So not only are they focused on trying to bounce back and rebreed, but they're also trying to maintain themselves and also grow. So nutrient requirements. I have 2 little tables here that I took from Missouri. And one's labeled spring calving and fall calving. That wasn't the point of adding this, but just kind of showing that at the time the highest demand is post calving, because that cow is trying to maintain herself, but also raise that calf at her side. So in our area of lowest demand is post weaning. So once we get that calf off them, that's where we can be most efficient to increase their body condition and get them to that spot where we can we can have them prepared or at a higher body condition score. That way, whenever that next calf is on the ground, we're not having to deal with problems with nutrition. So how do we assess nutrition? Generally, we use a body condition score, and in beef cattle, that score or that scale is from 1 to 9, 1 being extremely thin and 9 being obese. The problem is with the body condition score, that scale, is that it's extremely subjective. What I call a 7 may not be what you call a 7. Now I'll show an image here, and I think the next slide that will kind of outline what we should be looking at, and that's a good thing to reference, and we can find that online and kind of tailor that way we're all kind of thinking on the same wavelength. But ultimately, consistency is important. If you call one cow 7 and you have an identical cow, she should also be a 7. That's going to be our biggest factor in also kind of managing and monitoring these cattle as we go along. I wanted to throw in one caveat there is that we can have some breed differences. Along like a Texas Longhorn 6 is probably going to be different than a Beefmaster 6. Okay. So that's also something to kind of take into consideration. I really like these images. These are also from Missouri. I really like kind of seeing our cattle here in the middle, more so sitting at a body condition score of 5 and 6. My cows I have at home, I actually prefer a 7, and fat sells. But the problem is that whenever we have these body condition scores of 8 and 9s, we kind of have to question ourselves, well, how did they get that way, or why did they get that way? And more times than not, whenever I see that and I have a producer is like, hey, well, doc, she looks so good, she's fat, and but she doesn't have a calf, or she didn't have a calf this past year. Well, that's probably how she got that way, is because she didn't wean a calf the following season and continue to be on a good nutrition diet. And so something to kind of think about. And of course, down the road, or whenever we can have conversation, when I'm not fighting time to get the rest of this PowerPoint done, we can talk about some problems with on either side of this scale, with terms of fertility and everything else. One thing with nutrition, I wanted to kind of put into consideration, most producers are good about thinking, oh, do I need to give cubes or feed? A lot of us, especially this time of year, especially with this weather we're in right now, are feeding hay. But I'll ask my producers or my friends that raise cattle and ask them, well, what's your hay quality like? And they don't really know. So it's important if you can, to find someone to help you do it, or buy the equipment yourself and have it sit off to have that hay assessed, whether you're buying it or raising it yourself. Some quick little guidelines I wanted to kind of throw in here, because this is what I was brought up on, was that we should be striving for a 12% protein with a 60% TDN. Now, I know that's sometimes hard, especially whenever hay is slim, but with a minimum of a 10% protein and a 50% TDN. With nutrition, also, mineral is extremely important. So those cattle should be eating roughly about 4 ounces a day. What that adds up to is a roughly 1 bag per 30 head per week. Now we have a couple options, and well, let me back up. One thing that we may see is that we may not see that cow go to the mineral, or get mineral every single day. She may load up on it a couple of days and then not eat it for a week. But whenever we look at that average over the course of the entire year, that's what it comes out to be. We have a couple options in terms of mineral supplementation. I prefer a loose mineral. The mineral tubs are a great choice, but they're very expensive. One thing I will kind of throw in there is that the compressed mineral blocks, what you kind of see up there in the top right corner, it's extremely hard for a cow to reach her daily requirement whenever all she has is a compressed mineral block. Whenever you look at that feed label on the mineral, you'll probably see that most products contain 20 to 25% salt. And that's because salt drives consumption. Cattle often, like I've been told, crave salt, and also those trace minerals can be very bitter, and so the salt helps them consume that, but it also acts as a limiter. All right, transitioning from nutrition and everything going into fertility. There's some things we can look at in females fertility, but whenever I think fertility, I like to talk about and consider the bull side of it. So we should be having BSEs done on our bulls. That a BSE, if you're out in the market and looking for a bull, they should have one done before they're sold. And if they don't, you should have it done soon after you buy them. Just see where that bull's at and make sure everything's all right before we go out and try to turn them on cows. I like to do a BSE 30 to 60 days prior to turning them out with females. That does a couple things, is let us reassess the bull if he didn't collect so well, or if we saw some changes to morphology or motility, and also gives it a little bit of buffer if that bull's not going to work out, to make arrangements that way we have them. Part of that BSE is a thorough physical exam. So your veterinarian should be looking at his ears, his eyes, his feet, body condition score, because I anticipate that bull to lose a little bit of weight whenever we turn him out and he goes to work. We should also be feeling his scrotum, palpating his testes, parts of the epididymis, part of the cord, and also a big factor is doing a thorough rectal exam. That way we can feel those accessory sex glands. And then whenever I go to collect them, I want to see that penis extend. That's huge, because if you're not examining the penis, you're not doing a thorough exam. And I've had a few times where a producer has come in here and they said they had a BSD done, and for the fertility was great. They said the veterinarian said the motility and morphology were fine, but he's not getting anything bred. Well, and then I go and extend that penis, and he has a persistent frenulum, which is not a big deal, but it can definitely be frustrating for you as a producer, because everything, he's producing good semen, but he's not able to get that penis extended to service the cow. At the time of doing a BSE, we should also be doing a trick test, or a trichomoniasis testing. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. So trichomoniasis, or we just call it trick for the most part, is a venereal disease. So an infected bull can breed a cow, and then that cow becomes a host, and she can go on and infect other bulls. But it causes early embryonic death or loss of early pregnancy. So we'll have those cows come up not getting bred. So and that, with that being said, that's something we kind of have to caution. And I want to caution you as a producer, whenever you're buying open cows or cows that aren't bred, whether it be from a sale barn or a producer or a cow trader, it's something to be aware of. The downside of that is there's no approved test for females, and that's why we test the bulls, and it's important to test the bulls. And so if you have a bull that's coming into the property, or if you're leasing a bull, or you're allowing your cousin, brother, uncle, friend borrow your bull, you should have that bull tested before they leave, or before they come onto the property, just to make sure that we're not transferring that to any set of cows. So breeding, I encourage y'all as new producers to consider developing a breeding season, whether that be in the fall or the spring, or to try to target that fall calving date or that spring calving date. One thing kind of take into consider is the season. I know Texas, our weather can sometimes vary year to year, whether it's fall or summer, but we can kind of plan on having some extra forage there right after calving. That way we can help supplement and support those cows through raising that calf. Also, one big factor is marketability. Whenever we have a breeding season, we can have a more uniform calf crop. That way we're not having a 2-month-old here and a 9-month-old there to try to market. And then that also allows us, from a producer and a veterinarian standpoint, determine which cows got bred, had a calf, and which ones weaned a calf. And that kind of helps us look back at fertility and if we need to inspect or further any investigations. So with all that kind of overview being said, I understand that the what was marketed on the website and maybe email, if you got it, was talking about herd health schedules. And starting off this presentation, I kind of went back and said that I'm sorry, I had something pop up on my screen here. It's hard to do that because every producer is a little bit different, whether it's skill or facilities or labor being a huge one, because sometimes people have a little extra help to come help them, or they have to rely on their family coming home for Thanksgiving or Easter to help out. So with that being said, there's no single best protocol. And so in the next couple of slides, I kind of broke it down to different production, I guess, checkpoints and what we should be kind of doing at each of those checkpoints. So starting off, pre-weaning, recommend vaccinating calves anywhere from 60 days to 7 months, but I prefer vaccinating those calves 2 to 3 weeks prior to weaning. That's because, and something we have to consider is that colostrum immunity I talked about earlier. Those calves are getting immunity or antibodies from their mother's colostrum. Sometimes that can interfere with our vaccine efficacy. But if we're vaccinating 2 to 3 weeks prior to weaning, you follow up with your vaccine label. That's about that 21-day mark where we should be boostering vaccines. It also, weaning is extremely stressful. It's probably, and I've heard some people say, and that weaning is probably the most stressful point in that calf's life. Now, there's other times of stress, but whenever we look at stress can have a great impact on our immune function and our ability to build immunity. So if we give those calves a little bit of, I guess they're not naive to pathogens before then, we can have a better a foot on the ground and building that immunity. And also weaning is our time of highest risk for those calves getting sick. At this time, we can also vaccinate replacement heifers that we're going to plan on keeping. And those vaccines that we should be using is like a 4-way viral with a Clostridial. And tetanus, if we're planning on castrating those calves, those bull calves here pretty soon, it's nice to have a tetanus toxoid on board, and we can booster that at the time that we castrate them. So weaning time, if we haven't done already, we should definitely be vaccinating them at weaning, and that those are going to be the same list of vaccines that I just talked about, with like a 4-way viral and a Clostridial. And like I talked on the last slide, is that weaning is very stressful, and that stress can impact the efficacy of that vaccine. Also, right now, since we're working them, it's a great time to deworm those calves. So pre-breeding cows and heifers. I like to vaccinate or recommend vaccinating those cows 5 to 6 weeks prior to the breeding season. We can vaccinate those with our 4-way viral or Clostridial, and also include Vibrio lepto. And that's going to be the same for the heifers. And then we should deworm those replacement heifers, since they're the ones that are younger and more susceptible to high parasitic burdens. And then consider deworming those cows, looking at their body condition score, determine if they need it, and working with a veterinarian if we have to on that. And earlier in this presentation, I talked about going, and when that calf's born, it's born without any immunity, and when the immune that they do get, or immunity that they do get from the dam's colostrum, all that is from her maternal antibodies, and that's the antibodies that are floating around in our serum. So if we're vaccinating those cows and those heifers, we're going to have a better immune function in them and protect them, but as well as pass on some of that immunity to our young calves. So if we're in a system where we're correct checking, if those cows weren't boosted or vaccinated pre-breeding, we should be going ahead and vaccinating them then. One thing to be aware of is that we're not using modified live vaccines. I know, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, is some of those are labeled safe for pregnant females, but we can have some issues there. And then like that last slide is, if we didn't get to do it pre-breeding, we should be deworming those heifers and consider deworming those adult cows if we need it. Pre-calving, and I talked about this earlier on in the presentation about whenever we're talking about recommended vaccines. And so if your production system allows it, we often see that rotavirus and coronavirus and E. coli are the kind of the top three in a young calf to cause some calf scourge or calf diarrhea. And so there is vaccines labeled for cows, pregnant cows. Everyone's a little bit different in how soon you should vaccinate those prior to calving. But so if that's something you want to implement, and I encourage you do, just follow the label on when to give that. And then lastly, talking about our bulls, and I talked a little bit earlier about we should be doing a breeding soundness exam before we turn those bulls out prior to breeding. We can give them that 4-way viral. Bulls that come in for BSEs, I like to give an 8-way Clostridial. Just give them a little edge, and then a Vibrio lepto. At this time, you can also consider deworming them, depending on recommendation of your veterinarian or the body condition of them, and also looking into that liver fluke control that I talked about earlier. With all that being said, here's my contact information. If you have any questions, and if I don't have time to answer your questions before 2 o'clock, before my one of my technicians probably comes and tries to grab me for an appointment, you can that's my personal email. You can send me an email. You can call me here at the office, or if you need to stop by or whatever, there's our address. We also have a Facebook page. I've kind of made it my New Year's resolution to be better about social media and marketing and showing producers what we can do and how we can help and the options, treatment options we provide. And so you can give us a like on Facebook and hopefully and reach out that way as well.
Well, thanks, Dr. Warner. And do you have time for a few questions? We have a few in the chat box.
Yeah, what time is it? Yes, I do.
Okay. And we'll answer a few questions. And like Dr. Warner said, if we don't get to you today, just shoot us an email, either at his personal email or education@tscra.org, and we will make sure to get you those answers. So just a few quick questions that are in the chat box.
Okay, let's see.
Do you want to pick them? Do you see them?
Yeah. All right. So I guess, Bob, let's start with some of your questions here. So we do see a little bit of passive transfer of those vaccines to calf, as I kind of mentioned earlier. Also, I like giving, like, I hopefully I answer this question, but giving those a tetanus to those bull calves prior to castration. That allows us to have that immunity on board, because in cattle, whenever I do see tetanus, fortunately I don't see it very often. And growing up here and in a practice that we see a lot of cattle, but also now that I'm in my own practice myself, when I do see tetanus, it's in calves that were previously castrated, and sometimes cows that have retained placenta. Now that's a whole kind of deeper subject, but ultimately, if we give those calves something a few weeks prior to, like, weaning or branding, whenever we're going to go ahead and castrate them, and that way we have it on board and then booster them at the time that we do it, we should be covered. And then Ross has a question about feeding horses. I feel like I'd be stepping on some equine nutritionist toes if I were to speak for the equine industry. Certainly things considered. I think usually our horses are also getting fed maybe a grain product or other supplementation. So we have to worry about getting too much protein there and digestibility. Of course, they have a complete different digestive tract. So I'd be happy to try to answer that later. There's some other things we have to kind of consider when we're doing that. So I'll save that question if we want to talk about that a little bit later. Let's see. And I also saw a question here about giving multi-min. So I won't talk too much on that, but what I will say is that multi-min is not a replacement for free choice mineral. And so also I've seen some issues, especially in Bos Indicus type cattle or Brahman type cattle, where we get too much of a good thing. So and that being especially copper, during stressful events, that liver will sometimes contract or those minerals will go throughout the body, and we can run into some secondary issues with that. And I've seen those cattle had been given mineral or multi-min injection and pretty soon before that. So it's certainly something we can do, and I think it's a tool, but I don't think it's a replacement for free choice loose mineral or just free choice mineral in period. And then I saw a question here. Okay. How do we determine the amount of mineral to give per 30 head? So that's hard to say exactly how do we, or I guess maybe I don't understand the question too well, but when it comes to that mineral, and that's why I like free choice and loose mineral, is that we can find a way to, and I had a couple images there of either like a mineral bunk or one of those that kind of moves with the wind. Now those, if we get high winds, I've seen can kind of get tore up, or if we have a bull out there and maybe some of those spunkier cows that can tear those up pretty easy. But I just keep that mineral feeder filled up year round. Now, if I think they're going through a lot very fast, you can supplement salt block or put some extra salt in that mineral to kind of cut it a little bit, and that may also meet their craving. And I talked about a little bit on that that salt drives the consumption, but it also helps limit it, because if you ever had something really salty, you usually end up getting pretty thirsty thereafter. And so those cattle will leave and go get some water, and they may not come back to the bunk for a little while. Okay, and I didn't touch this, but it was in my PowerPoint, and I see that someone found it. That I recommended that heifers, we start breeding heifers or expose them to a bull or start breeding them 30 days prior to breeding cows, and that's just to give us a little bit of leeway. Sometimes those cow or heifers, in my experience, can take a little. They need a little bit extra help to get that first calf or get bred for the first time, and that's for a variety of things. It could be age related or puberty related, and are they cycling yet? So that just gives us a little extra time for those heifers that aren't quite there ready to breed, but they're close. Am I available for mentorship and consulting? Of course. I love to teach. I actually have an extern in right now. So I enjoyed talking with producers and vet students and people that are interested in veterinary medicine. So I do provide some mentorship, and I do some consulting. That's something, if you want to reach out at some other time, and if you have some questions specific to your operation or whatever, and maybe we can sit around and schedule a time to sit down and have a conversation. When do we recommend preg testing? So that's dependent, and that's why I recommended that our producers we'll go and kind of develop a breeding season. That way we know when we turn those bulls out, and that way we can set that day, like that. Let's just use for example, it's we turn bulls out today, which is January 16th, and then we pull those bulls out say 90 days later, depending on a cow herd and everything. We can schedule or plan on preg checking those at probably a month after that, or 2 months after that. It's kind of dependent on rectal palpation. We can, depending on the skill of your veterinarian, can determine. I would say 45 days is fairly a good benchmark for most veterinarians to be able to palpate onward, and then we can kind of get a better idea. And then of course with the advancements in technology, and we have ultrasound, we can use that to get an accurate size, or like see that fetus and or the cotyledon size, or take different measurements of the fetus and get a fairly accurate a gestation length, and get that idea. And what that allows us to do in preg checking is we can also kind of break those cattle up on how far along they are, and also those that maybe need some more nutrition or a little bit extra care. That's a good time that we can sort those cattle, and that way we have them in different cohorts. What is the best pasture management practices for parasite prevention in cattle herds and worm flies, etc.? So that kind of goes back. There's no singular right answer. But and it's very dependent on the producer and on how much land you have, what's your cross fencing look like, what's your cow herd look like, and the season. And so it's a hard one to kind of sum up very shortly. But we can try to develop a rotation, and it's more of just monitoring your cows and monitoring the grass that they're on. Of course, if we're supplementing hay and feed or cubes, sometimes we can kind of change that grazing pattern and management a little bit. Add garlic salt to increase mineral consumption. I haven't heard that, but that's interesting. And then thank you for your feedback, and I hope that y'all all got something out of this. I like I said, I'm extremely happy to teach and share my knowledge, and I'm still learning every day, but I hope that I got everything answered. And again, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to work with y'all, and that's why I do the job that I do.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Warner. And we just want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today on our Ranching 101 webinar. And we hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank y'all.